Yeah, well, I mean, that was my argument too to some leftists, which is like, get behind this campaign, and I say so with some reservations, only because I feel like it can't. It can only be good to one degree or another, right? Either he wins, and then we have the means to sort of organize and begin to mobilize people on the scale that has not been done in a long time. And then Sanders himself is calling for what he calls the political revolution, which is sort of vague, but the idea is, and I think that he believes this, that even if he is elected, people would need to be mobilized to hold their politicians accountable. So that's like the rosiest case scenario. But even if he because the Green Party members and socialists often say, well, the superdelegates won't ever let it happen and they'll overthrow the will of the people and appoint Clinton the nominee or whatever. I said, well, that's also one of the best cases scenario, one of the best case scenario, because if that happens, then the Democratic Party will be revealing themselves, right? And there will be they will have totally discredited themselves for at least a generation, and they will reveal themselves as being thoroughly undemocratic. And I think that would be a wonderful thing, because I think the party would crack apart at that point.
Well, I mean, you've seen that on the Republican side,
Yeah.
Which I think they're a few years ahead of us in some ways, in that process that you're describing, which is, the party having its mask ripped off and the constituents being so angry at feeling that they're not being represented. I mean, the Tea Party, we talk about this a lot, right? The left needs to learn some stuff from the right. And the Tea Party, Tea Party emerged roughly the same time as Occupy Wall Street, and ended up with a more or less taking over Congress. So and that's incredible, and there's something to be learned from that.
Well, but what is that, David? Right? Because the right is much more hierarchical than the left, and that's always going to be a problem, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, well, what do you mean by that?
Well, the right seems to be better at organizing and sort of acquiescing to leadership. Whereas the left, I mean, you just compare Occupy to the Tea Party movement. I mean, Occupy was a leaderless movement, intentionally so. And I think that's a good thing, but it poses a lot of problems.
Yeah, well, we've seen that for a long time, is the left kind of skepticism about taking power.
Right.
And that's really tricky. And I admit I've been part of that in the sense of I've expressed a lot of skepticism about taking power and about the power of the state and what happens to people once they become part of the state machinery. It's tricky psychological and sociological territory in a lot of ways. But yeah, I do think that was, in some ways we can describe that as a failure of Occupy to really, create a political movement that could take power in that direct way. And that was, in part because of the nature of that kind of horizontalist kind of approach. But at the same time, we have the Occupy energy. I think we can say did release something, right? And we are seeing the effect of it. And I don't think that Bernie Sanders is necessarily it's all Occupy people that are explaining his success among young people. But in a lot of ways, you can say that general idea of entering the 1% idea into the cultural lexicon, that alone is allowing Bernie Sanders to kind of capitalize. That's a funny word to use there, but to kind of capitalize on that the general kind of energy that Occupy Wall Street brought to the table. So in a lot, the Tea Party's better at putting up candidates and winning elections, and the left has been kind of more. The left is troubled by taking power in a lot of ways, and they don't want to become the establishment, and I think that's part of explaining a little bit of why they haven't been so successful.
Do you think the old sort of binary of capitalism versus socialism, does that still hold? Are those our only options, or do we need to somehow create another option?
Well, I do think we need to create another option. I mean, in part, that's kind of been my whole kind of take on things. I always try to take a step back and try to think of approach these situations in world history from the perspective of kind of an alien, and see capitalism and socialism as kind of twin ideologies as part of a very kind of limited way of thinking, a limited framework of what the possibilities for human societies could be. I feel like, on one hand, socialism seems like something we should give more of a thorough try to. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I do feel like, human beings can evolve to even better systems than that. I don't know what they would be, but it seems like, I don't know. I would feel like disappointed if it were only capitalism versus socialism. There's got to be something more transformative in store for us than that.
So forget predicting anything about the 2016 presidential election.
Yeah.
But what is your best case scenario? What would you most like to see come out of this electoral cycle?
Oh, man, I'm so much better at projecting worst case scenarios. That's hard. I mean, I think that, in the one hand, the scenario that you said, where kind of like, no matter what happens, the kind of further the further development of a feeling in American society that deep changes need to take place, particularly in what we would call the establishment, and particularly what we would call capitalism. I mean, to me, I want to see capitalism reined in, whatever that might be. I know that socialism is the kind of hot answer right now, and I don't disagree that socialist policies would be the best way for us to move forward through this stuff. But for me, like, the best case scenario is for something to happen in American culture and in a larger world culture in which capitalism becomes kind of universally viewed as a poison and as a historical anomaly, and as a system that needs to be immediately dismantled and moved on from. And I'm not sure what that will look like. I don't make predictions, but if there's any positive scenario in my mind, it's the scenario in which human beings are freed from the powers that control them, and those powers right now are global capitalism, and they're rather ugly. We haven't talked about climate change at all, but that's a big part of it for me too. It's like kind of understanding that we are at a critical moment for not only the survival of humanity, but the survival of the planet itself, and the ability of the planet to sustain human life. I don't know if many people understand how dire the situation is. I think a lot of people do, and that might be what's driving the political moment as well. But either way, I think we're at an incredibly critical moment for humanity, and Bernie Sanders is not necessarily going to move us at the rate and with the strength that we need to move.
Well, right. The irony is that Bernie Sanders is not. Socialists would say, well, he's not really socialist. He's really a New Deal Democrat, old school New Deal Democrat, or European style social democrat, right?
Yeah, which would be great,
right? Well, but would it?
It's been so long since we've had that, but at the same time, it doesn't seem like that's enough right now.
Well, exactly, and I think there are those, like Marxist economist Richard D. Wolff. He's been on the show a couple times, and he says, sure. We've tried that, right? And unless you fundamentally alter the structures of society, and particularly the economic structures of society, then you're going to, because the New Deal, there's the leftist critique of the New Deal, of course, which I think is accurate, and I think FDR would have admitted so, was that it saved capitalism from itself.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
And so, but in doing so, it allowed the levers of power to remain at least accessible to the forces of capital, which then fought and clawed their way back and then undid all of the gains of the New Deal. Maybe not all of them. Right. That's exaggerating, but
quite a few of them, and if you watched the GOP debate last night, they were talking about Social Security, and they want it, and they want education. The right wants all that money, so you're right in the sense that it is being dismantled.
Well, and so it leaves. Personally, I feel like I'm in a really tough spot because I I see and I recognize and I share some of the criticisms of the Sanders campaign, but to a certain extent, it's so funny because I feel like I'm arguing to the people on my left that, well, listen, we need to be pragmatic and this is the best chance we have. And I'm arguing to the people on my right, the Clinton supporters, listen, we need to be idealistic and vote for vote our conscience. And so I'm like caught in this vice where it's like things really do feel dire. I don't think that Sanders would go far enough or be the change that we need. But it seems like on a certain level, like that it is the best that we can get right now. And why not push hard for it?
Yeah, you have to. There is no candidate other than Bernie Sanders that's worth voting for in this election. To me, he's the only candidate that's a legitimate choice worth considering at all.
I can hear my green friends crying out, what about Dr. Stein, right?
Right. I mean, sure. I mean, there is that. That's. I've never really gotten into the Green Party too much. But either way, I don't blame people for wanting to vote for Bernie Sanders. I mean, all the criticism that I throw at Bernie Sanders is left infighting that's been going on for a long time. And in that sense, I do see it as a positive development that he's on the scene and that he's out there. I mean, everyone should vote for him. And when I see him win, I get excited, and when I see him talk, I agree with almost everything he has to say. A lot of this is kind of like looking at it from in a kind of larger historical lens and kind of figuring out, okay, what does this really mean that this guy, this Bernie Sanders, who I know, I've been following the left for a long time. Bernie Sanders has kind of been this guy in the background that's been around forever. This kind of one outlier in Congress. We always knew that he's there, he's doing his best. I always kind of felt pity for Bernie Sanders in a lot of ways because it was like he's the one guy in Congress that is screaming about all this stuff for 50 years. So, in that sense, anyone would be – I don't understand anyone who would vote for Hillary Clinton. I really don't. I mean, I get that people are like, making the pragmatic choice. They think she can win. But, it looks like Bernie could win too.
Right.
It seems to be that Bernie could be just as strong a candidate in the general election.
Well, and Clinton's policies, I mean, if you look at them and you compare them to the Republican Party of not so long ago, I mean, she's a Republican. There's really no progressive values there.
She's a Republican that doesn't say the racist stuff.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Like that's what kind of is the dividing line for her.
All right, so
she's kind of a touchy-feely Republican,
right?
But in terms of economic policies, and in part, like if she were to lose to Bernie Sanders, like part of my fantasy would be able to kind of see her and look her in the eye and just say it's the economy, stupid,
right?
To kind of like bring it back full circle because they were the Clintons in the 90s were the ones that were kind of pursuing that idea.
Right.
And now once Bernie Sanders is kind of bringing it up in a more real way, that economic matters are kind of the heart of what Americans are concerned about and the issues that unite Americans across race. Now they don't want to have that conversation. Well, now they want to split it up.
Right. And my best case scenario is, look, Sanders wins the nomination, wins the presidency on a wave election and, transforms the complexion of Congress. But he opens up the door for a serious conversation on the left where we push him further. And all of a sudden we have the momentum where the pendulum starts to swing back the other way. That's my hope.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the paradox is because, the energy that is required to be able to push politicians to the point where they're forced to make concessions to the working class or to the people, that energy often is the result of things going really badly, right? And like what you were saying about how kind of maybe one best case scenario might be Hillary Clinton, overriding Bernie Sanders' electoral win through superdelegates, because then people would be so disillusioned that they'd be taken to the streets and kind of. I've thought about that a lot, and it is a kind of paradox of politics in some ways, because you need people to be outraged, you need people to be suffering in some way for them to gather together and create solidarity. I think the left, in part, is hoping that that's not true, that like people can just show up to rallies because they want to. But for me, I feel like politics is much more driven by by people understanding circumstances that are actually happening to them and being outraged about it.
Right, and it's treacherous, right? Because it can go in one of either directions, and it could go towards authoritarianism just as easily as it could go towards egalitarianism.
That's right, and I think that in a kind of miniature way, we're seeing that in this election. That same energy of outrage goes in two different directions. It goes at outrage of lefty young people that want Bernie Sanders to give them single payer health care, to it goes to outraged, older white folks that think Donald Trump is going to, finally take the country back from the Mexicans.
Well, I've kept you long enough, David, but I want to ask you one more question before you go, because I really do enjoy your show, The Nostalgia Trap, and I encourage people to check it out. But I'm curious, genuinely curious. I'd like to know what are you doing with this show? What is your hope for the impact of the show? What is the Nostalgia Trap?
Well, the Nostalgia Trap, I started as a kind of my thought was to be a kind of Mark Maron podcast of lefty academics. So I talked to Marxists and radicals, and not just academics, but other radical people, and kind of figure out the things in their life that led them down that path. To radicalization of politics, etc., and it's also just a chance to talk about politics.
Mm-hmm.
But if anything, it's I come from nerdy historians, and I went to graduate school for history, and a part of me likes the idea of archiving oral histories and kind of getting a nice hour-long recording of people who I consider to be really smart people and really engaged people, and kind of understanding what was it that drove them to this, and what are their thoughts about it? I mean, in part, I don't know what I want the show to become. I really just enjoy doing the interviews, and I've got a little audience and enjoy interacting with that audience and having fun with it. But I in a lot of ways, the show is an opportunity to just talk about politics and find my own voice and find my own kind of attitude towards this stuff. Because like we've had in this conversation, we're living in incredibly complicated times, and we're living in times that are actually, have multiple narratives going on the surface and below the surface. And I think it takes a lot of kind of historical thought and political talk with smart people to be able to figure that out. So I always say I try to find people, that are smarter than I am to be able to explain this stuff to me, because I am really, really interested in what is happening in not only America but in the world right now. I think we're at such a vital moment, which is like a kind of critical transitional moment towards something new, whatever it might be. And I thought it would be important to sit down and talk with some people about what it all might mean.
Well, my guest has been David Parsons. He's a professor of history at NYU and CUNY and the host of the podcast, The Nostalgia Trap. You can find episodes at nostalgiatrap.com. Who's coming up on the show, David?
Let's see. We just had Corey Robin as the guest. I have Joanna Fernandez, who I mentioned. She's a professor of Black Studies at CUNY, who has an amazing story to tell about her relationship with Mumia Abu-Jamal, who's been a kind of a big figure on the left for many years. And then let's see. Tomorrow I'll be interviewing Freddie DeBoer, who's a figure who a lot of people that listen to this show and that listen to Nostalgia Trap might know as a big left writer who writes a lot of blogs and a lot of big left publications. So I can't wait to talk to him. Exciting stuff. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much for being here, David. Appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.